This is Lesson 21.5, The Revolutions of 1848. What were the main causes and results of the revolutions of 1848? That's a historical thinking skill, by the way. Causes and results, or causes and effects. College Board Topic 6.6, Revolutions and Reactions. Explain how and why various groups reacted against the existing order from 1815 to 1914. And then we've got a statement that's specific to the year 1848. The revolutions of 1848, triggered by economic hardship and discontent with the political status quo, challenged conservative politicians and governments and led to the breakdown of the concert of Europe. And we've got a great picture right here of a barricade in Paris in the year 1848. Places: France, Austria, Hungary, Northern Italy, Prussia, German Confederation. So lots going on everywhere. Key concepts of the revolutions of 1848: the Galician Slaughter, social workshops, the French Second Republic, the June Days, and the Sonderbund War. Key people of the revolutions of 1848: we've got the Ferdinands and we've got the Louis. We've got King Ferdinand II of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. We've got Emperor Ferdinand I of Austria. We've got King Louis Philippe. We've got President Louis Napoleon, president for now, and we've got the utopian socialist Louis Blanc. Tensions in the 1840s. There was a series of bad harvests. We're most familiar with the potato blight of 1845 in Ireland, but that was really happening throughout Europe and causing all kinds of havoc. It's just that Ireland suffered especially because of its near total dependence on the potato. Industrialization was going on, but it was uneven. It was uneven in different areas of Europe, and it was also uneven in different sectors of the economy. And when that happens, positive change gets disrupted. Industrialization can't provide new jobs quickly enough, it can't raise incomes quickly enough, and this dissatisfaction boosts radical ideologies. Then you had limited revolts all across Europe leading up to the year 1848, and we talked about several of those in the last lesson. You had a rebellion in Austria in 1846, and this occurred in the Austrian partition of Poland. If you'll remember, Poland had been completely partitioned between Austria, Prussia, and Russia. And this particular event was called the Galician Slaughter, and it began with a peasant revolt against serfdom. Galician peasants killed about 1,000 noblemen, destroyed about 500 manors, and the Austrian government then used this uprising as an excuse to kill a bunch of nationalist Polish nobles. These nobles had been planning an uprising of their own against Austria. There was also a civil war in Switzerland in 1847. It was called the Sonderbund War, and it was over whether Switzerland would remain a confederation or become a federation. And the federation forces actually won for the time being. Luckily, casualties in that particular war, the Sonderbund War, were very light. There were also uprisings in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. This country was created by the Congress of Vienna in 1815, and these uprisings began in 1848. And these uprisings occurred in Sicily, Salerno, and Naples. Rebels forced King Ferdinand II, King of the Two Sicilies, who reigned from 1830 to 1859, to sign off on a provisional constitutional government. Well, there was a response to that. The Italians in the northern provinces of Lombardy and Venetia got jealous of the freedoms specified in that constitution that those southern Italians now had in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. But the Lombards and the Venetians, they were under Austrian control, so they rebelled against their Austrian rulers. Meanwhile, Clemens von Metternich and his Concert of Europe were still trying to control all of this upheaval. Here's how an 1848 revolt usually went down. First, liberals would demand three basic pillars of freedom from their authoritarian regimes: a constitution, which meant a limited government; a representative government, and that means election reform; 3, civil liberties, and that means individual freedoms; And so governments are usually slow to respond to demands like these, of course. So, because of that slowness, there's a popular revolt. But this popular revolt has a great, very exploitable weakness to it. And it's this: it consists of an unstable coalition of classes and groups. For example, urban workers, students, middle class liberals, peasants who don't own property. Groups like this don't necessarily get along with each other. They work best when the enemy is present and in their face, but once the battle is won and they're in charge, things start to fall apart because these different groups have different values and different agendas. So this coalition, let's say it builds barricades in the cities to disrupt the government and block the army. There's often armed fighting. The coalition wins for a time. And this coalition gains power and then almost immediately begins to break down. These are patterns that happen over and over in 1848. The coalition is divided among class lines. They're divided between urban and rural lines, and they're divided along ethnic lines. Conservatives come back and take advantage of the chaos, and they reassert themselves and gain their power back. And those conservatives consist of the monarch, the landed aristocracy, and the army. And these conservatives, once they regain control, they roll back most of the reforms that the revolutionaries had gained. And in 1848, this pattern was taking place all over continental Europe at the same time. It all began in France with a full-scale revolution in the year 1848. Clemens von Metternich was famous for saying, "When France sneezes, all Europe catches cold." The most developed countries in Europe, like Great Britain, Belgium, and the Netherlands, they escaped all of this 1848 disruption. And by the same token, the least developed countries like Russia and the Ottoman Empire, they also got lucky and escaped all of this disruption. But everyone else, everyone in the middle, saw upheaval. Governments toppled. Monarchs either fled or accepted constitutions. Louis Philippe had already reigned as King of France for 18 years by the year 1848. He had already agreed to a constitution at the beginning of his reign, and that is pillar number 1. If you go back to the 3 basic pillars of freedom that liberals demand from authoritarian regimes, the first one is a constitution. But that was as far as King Louis Philippe was willing to go. He never budged on a single social reform, and he never budged on a single electoral reform. Now, you had crop failures going on in the year 1846 to 1847. And Louis Philippe should have learned from history. He should have known that crop failures had also been a major factor in the French Revolution of 1789. And this is why schools all over the world teach history, isn't it? Louis Philippe did almost nothing to keep these crop failures from pulling down the entire economy. Louis Philippe was caught in the middle against all of these other people, all of these other groups and agendas. He had the National Guard, the students, the bourgeoisie, consisting of merchants and opposition deputies and liberal intellectuals, and the middle class, consisting of shopkeepers and artisans. And he also had unskilled workers to contend with. There was a popular revolt in Paris. There formed a coalition of 3 out of the 4 groups that we just listed. They armed themselves, they built barricades in the streets to disrupt government intervention, and the National Guard even broke ranks and joined these revolutionaries. To Louis Philippe's credit, though, he refused to call in the regular army. He could have made this a bloodbath, but he chose not to. Instead, he abdicated and left office. He did try to leave his grandson as king, but the revolutionaries didn't want any more kings. Louis Philippe was replaced by a 10-man executive committee. They drafted a new constitution for the French Second Republic, and we know all about the First Republic, don't we? Their rally cry was liberty, fraternity, equality. Every adult male had the right to vote. They instituted workplace reforms. All slaves in the colonies were freed. Now, that might sound weird because we learned that the first French Republic had abolished slavery in 1794, and that was true, but it was also limited. In fact, by 1802, they had reestablished slavery in all their colonies except Saint-Domingue, which had gained its independence. So from 1802 to 1848, France had slavery in all of its colonies. And finally, the death penalty was abolished in 1848. Here are three competing groups in our coalition. One group is the moderate, liberal, middle-class Republicans, and three things to understand about them are, number one, they had already agreed to universal male suffrage. So they didn't feel like they needed to give up any more since they had given that really big concession. And they were willing to give temporary relief to the poor, although no reform for the poor. Then you had your radical Republicans. They sympathized with the plight of the urban poor. They were highly influenced by the utopian socialists that we talked about, and they were committed to socialism, to having Louis Blanc working for them in the government. Finally, you had your urban artisans. They wanted strong unions, and they wanted worker-owned businesses. With the departure of Louis Philippe, the socialists seemed to have the upper hand. Louis Blanc, one of our utopian socialists, was appointed head of the new provisional government's labor commission. And Louis Blanc's main proposal was this: social workshops. These workshops would be permanent, they would be government-sponsored, they would be cooperative, and they would be an alternative to capitalism. They would be non-competitive. And Louis Blanc had already written a book on how to do this. Workers would primarily engage in public works projects. But Louis Blanc also had a compromise with the moderates. For example, he had to make these workshops temporary, and he had to form a commission to study the question of making them permanent like he wanted to. The workshop program, however, skyrocketed. Hundreds of thousands of workers were signing up for these workshops. Even people from other countries were coming into France and signing up. But they were also hotbeds of radical ideology. One of the main pillars of republicanism and socialism that we've talked about is universal male suffrage. And now it was time for elections because there was a new government. And there was an election for the 900 seats of the new Constitutional Assembly. And the socialists, they were sure they were going to sweep the field in these elections because of all of these newly qualified male voters who would vote for them, of course. But when the election was done and the votes were counted, the winners were as follows: 500 monarchists and conservatives out of 900 total seats, 270 moderate Republicans, and a pitiful 80 radicals and socialists. That's less than a tenth. In other words, the radicals and socialists were the big losers in the parliamentary elections. That was the exact opposite of what they had expected to happen with universal male suffrage. Why did this happen? How did it happen? Some said that it was ignorance, that all of these new voters simply didn't know what they were doing. But others gave them a little more credit than that. Others said that they knew exactly what they were doing. They were protecting their property from Louis Blanc and the socialists. Here was the central conflict of interests between urban and rural. The rural French peasantry tended to own their own property ever since the French Revolution had started way back in 1789. It was only the urban working poor who had nothing to lose in a socialist utopia. So the French peasants voted with the upper and middle classes to protect what was theirs. The only ones who voted for the socialists were the artisans and the unskilled workers of Paris. The socialists had one more desperate play for power. On May 13, 1848, they invaded the assembly and proclaimed a revolutionary state. Does that sound familiar? The National Guard, made up of middle class, squelched it. And from that point on, there were to be no more workshops in Paris. Workers in those shops had only two very impractical options. They could either join the army or they could move to a workshop out in the provinces. Now you were taking away the only relief that many of these urban workers had. And so a 3-day class war began. Middle class and peasants versus urban working class. They put up barricades to shut down the city, and these were called the June Days. The regular army attacked to put it down, and more than 10,000 were killed or injured. The Constitutional Assembly now went conservative. They framed a constitution that featured a strong executive. They elected Louis Napoleon to be the new president. He was Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew. He won by a landslide, and he was the first French leader to hold the title president. The people of France had gotten exactly what they had wanted. They got a semi-authoritarian regime, and they got an end to the socialist program. The Austrian Empire and anti-Imperial insurrection. For Austria, their revolutions started in Hungary in 1848. Hungarian nationalists demanded 3 things. Number 1, national autonomy from the Austrian Empire. Number 2, full civil liberties. And number 3, universal suffrage, for men, of course. Insurrection also broke out in Austria's Italian territories of Lombardy and Venetia, and we've already talked about why. And there were 5 days of heavy fighting in those areas, and they caused the Austrian army to retreat. Students and workers raised barricades in the capital to defy the government. Austrian Emperor Ferdinand I, who ruled from 1835 to 1848, was ready to make a deal with these rebels. He promised them a liberal constitution, and he promised new reforms. A deal like this was an anathema to Clemens von Metternich, and he refused to play along with it. So he was forced to resign, and he fled to London temporarily. His days of enforcing the concert of Europe were now over. He had been elitist, oppressive, and autocratic for over 30 years. But he had also maintained relative peace for over 30 years. And he would soon return to Austria anyway and work for the emperor, simply in a more limited advisory capacity. It looked like this radical coalition had beaten conservatism in Austria. Clemens von Metternich was out. Ferdinand I was willing to compromise. But as we've already seen, it's really hard to keep a coalition together that is divided among class lines. This coalition soon broke down over social workshops, and it also broke down over voting rights for all men. Ethnic divisions. In Hungary, the revolutionaries attempted to create a centralized Hungarian nation. They had a very liberal constitution, but half of the population of Hungary consisted of Croats, Serbs, and Romanians. And these ethnic minorities, they didn't want to be part of a Hungarian nation. They wanted their own political autonomy. Czech nationalists wanted to create a Czech nation, but the ethnic Czechs and the ethnic Germans couldn't get it together. However, on the other side, there was no ethnic strife within Austria's conservative aristocracy. Within that group and that class of people, values, language, culture, attitudes, and agendas were all the same. At this point, Archduchess Sophia of Bavaria came into the picture. She was married to Austrian Emperor Ferdinand I's brother, and she put together a coalition of nobles, and this coalition forced Ferdinand I to abdicate. Ferdinand had no heir, so that's a pretty good argument for abdication if you can't produce an heir. And Sophia had an adult son of her own, Franz Joseph. And so these nobles made Franz Joseph the new Austrian emperor. And once Ferdinand I was out of the way, Sophia didn't hesitate to take action against these rebels. Sophia went to all-out war against the working-class radicals and students. She sent the military. She had them use artillery. They bombarded the city of Prague, and they even bombarded barricades in the capital of Vienna itself. Sophia even got Russia to send 130,000 troops into Hungary and totally subdue it for her. Prussia and the German Confederation. Keep in mind that Prussia was the second most powerful member of the German Confederation, and it was an autocratic regime. Prussian reformers had two ambitious hopes for Prussia. Number one, to turn Prussia into a constitutional monarchy. And number two, even more ambitious, to have Prussia lead the German Confederation in forming a united German nation for the first time ever. As we know, multiple crises were happening in Germany at the same time. There were crop failures like everywhere else. There was economic crisis. Louis Philippe over in France had just fallen from power. And it seemed like the time was right for a liberal push for reform against a beleaguered regime. With Germany, there were two simultaneous liberal movements. In both arenas, things began in March 1848. There was Prussia with its capital, Berlin, and there was the rest of the German Confederation with its center at Frankfurt. In the German Confederation over in the city of Frankfurt, crowds across the Confederation started calling for the usual two things, liberal reforms and a constitutional parliament. And various regional rulers within the German Confederation gave in to these crowds. Meanwhile, in Prussia, artisans and factory workers started to riot in Berlin. They allied with middle-class liberals, and the Prussian king was Friedrich Wilhelm IV, Frederick William IV, and he promised the protesters two things that no Prussian king had ever promised before. Number one, a liberal constitution, and number two, even bigger, to merge Prussia with the German Confederation into a new German state. King Friedrich Wilhelm IV found himself caught in the middle between two opposing sides. Number one, you had the urban workers who wanted him to give even more than those two things. And then you had the Prussian aristocracy, the Junkers, who wanted him to give much less than that. Luckily for the Prussian aristocracy, the Junkers, this coalition between the urban workers and their middle-class allies was soon starting to break down. The workers were making some socialist demands, because when all you have to your name is a really unpleasant, low-paying job, socialism starts to sound pretty good. But this makes your middle-class reform allies nervous, because on the other hand, when you start getting an education and getting a profession and being able to buy some property, then socialism doesn't sound so good anymore. A Prussian Constituent Assembly met in Berlin to write a new Prussian constitution. The aristocratic conservatives urged Friedrich Wilhelm IV to stage a counter-revolution to shut them down. Meanwhile, in the rest of the German Confederation, a National Assembly was being elected, and the elected deputies met in May of 1848 in the city of Frankfurt. Their goal was to write a federal constitution, and that would mean a unified Germany for the first time. But the social elites of this group, they took over. These were men such as state officials, lawyers, professors, businessmen, and they wrote in the usual liberal reforms, constitutional monarchy, free speech, religious tolerance, abolition of aristocratic privilege. But they completely ignored the demands of the radicals. These radicals tended to be industrial workers and peasants who didn't have property like the French peasants did, Republicans, and socialists. Another question arose. Which German states would be in this new federation and which would be out? In response to this question, some deputies proposed a Greater Germany concept. And this would include Prussia, it would include the rest of the German Confederation, and all of the German-speaking parts of the Austrian Empire, but none of the non-German-speaking parts of the Austrian Empire. In other words, Austria would have to break up if this Greater Germany concept was created. Of course, Austria refused to be part of any kind of Greater Germany plan. Instead, the Austrians proposed a Lesser Germany plan, which would include Prussia, the rest of the German Confederation, and absolutely none, not 1 square foot, of Austria. In May of 1849, the Frankfurt National Assembly finished its constitution for a Lesser Germany. We can call it the Frankfurt Constitution. And the Frankfurt National Assembly went to Prussian King Friedrich Wilhelm IV and offered to make him this new Germany's new emperor. Unfortunately, it had taken them too long to get to this point. By this time, Friedrich Wilhelm IV had reasserted his autocratic authority in his home country of Prussia. And this was exactly what his aristocratic conservatives had wanted him to do. He and his Junkers had dissolved the Prussian Constituent Assembly that had been working on a new Prussian constitution. And Friedrich Wilhelm IV had rolled back all the previous reforms that he had agreed to. When the Frankfurt National Assembly visited Friedrich Wilhelm IV and offered to make him the emperor of this new Lesser Germany, he refused, saying he didn't want a, quote, crown from the gutter. He also declared that he would rather chop wood than rule in the manner of the King of England. In other words, King Friedrich Wilhelm IV had no interest in being a showpiece for a liberal constitutional government. In failure, the Frankfurt National Assembly dissolved itself. A more radical remnant met in the city of Stuttgart, but couldn't get anything accomplished. Prussia had to promise Austria that it would give up all hopes, all schemes, all plans, all talk of this Greater Germany concept. It was such a threat to Austria. The old German Confederation of 1815 was reestablished. The German reformers and radicals had completely failed all of their goals for now.